All right, welcome to Colaiste Ida Anatomy and Physiology that I am currently streaming from home. I know college has been shut down and you're all pretty stressed with assignments and other bits and pieces, but I'm here to cover basically what I was going to be covering anyway, which is the start of the revision of the different topics we've covered so far. And my plan today is to just go back over the skeleton, and then I'll spend some time answering some questions if anyone has any questions, and anything else is going to come up. My plan is tomorrow I'm not going to be streaming. It is St. Paddy's Day, and the day after I may do some stuff for microbiology. I will post up to Moodle the content I'm covering, so you should be able to get along with that and check out what's going on. All right, so to start out talking about the skeleton, we've mostly so far we did talk about the skeleton back in September, and just to revise what we covered at that time. But what is the skeleton? Well, the skeleton is a variety of functions. Primarily, the skeleton is there for support, it's there for attachment, it's there for development of blood cells, it's there for protection, it's there for allows movement, and it's there for mineral storage. And those 6 topics add together under the heading of SAD-PAM. So if you need to have a mnemonic to remember that, SAD-PAM: support, attachment, development, protection, allows movement, mineral storage. Now you might say, oh, and that's a bit awkward, and it is, but that's what we have for remembering this stuff. Now, just about functions of the skeleton first. So what does the skeleton do for us? Well, primarily the skeleton is integral to our ability to move. Skeletal muscular cooperation enables humans to move quickly and accurately. Were you to take a look at another creature, if you look at animals that lack skeletons and they live on land, they do not move fast. You can look at snails, which are basically entirely muscular based movement, or you can have a look at earthworms. They are not quick. They are in fact legendarily slow, because the skeleton allows you to direct power a lot quicker. If anyone's ever done any, even snakes use their skeleton to move. They walk effectively on their shoulder blades. So without it, moving fast and accurately becomes incredibly difficult. Now, it's slightly different if you take a look at something like the sea, where the skeleton isn't as important because you can use some other tactics to move around. Jellyfish, for example, can use just muscular action to squirt jets of water, and they can shoot around really quickly, but they have difficulty turning fast. So they basically got to reorientate themselves and then jet off again in a different direction. Similarly for squid or other soft-boned invertebrates like that. You'll see some animals which don't have a huge skeleton, like sharks, but they have effectively a skeletal-like system, only it's mostly made of cartilage. The only bone you'll find in a shark really is the jaws and teeth, and the rest of it is just soft cartilage. So without the skeleton, if I pulled out your skeleton and left you, you'd be a puddle of organs and muscles on the ground, and you might be able to shift over a little bit, but you wouldn't be moving around much at all. So if you break a bone, in order for that to heal properly, in order for that to avoid pain, you're going to need to have that set or immobilized. So primarily when we're looking at, okay, I've broken a bone, what do I do? Well, you wrap it up. You immobilize the thing, because without it, you're going to struggle to move around. And without being able to put weight on it, you're going to really struggle to move around. So it's integral to the ability to move. The skeleton also functions as armor for most of your essential organs. All right. If I asked you which organs can't you live without in the short term, well, the answer is first and foremost the brain, the heart, the spinal cord, the lungs. Any of those go, you're probably dead in under 2 minutes, certainly. You'll note that those are the best armored parts of the body. The brain is incredibly well armored. It's got the skull over it, which is a tough, rounded, very, very hard section of bone with only a couple of areas where it's thin at all. And most of those are reasonably inaccessible. It's curved, basically, so blows glance off it. It's effectively shaped by evolution to be incredibly efficient at protecting the brain. The spinal cord, you'll notice, is wrapped in irregular chunks of bone, your vertebrae, making an incredibly tough exterior covering. And we were talking to the nervous system about how important the spinal cord is and how much it does for it, how it relays all the information down to the muscles and takes information back up from the body. If something goes wrong with your spinal cord, you lose access to control, you lose access to sensation. As something really goes bad to the spinal cord, you can actually lose access to reflex arcs to keep you breathing. If I sever your spinal cord, you'll still breathe. If I damage a section of your spinal cord so your reflex arcs don't work, you won't breathe at all. So what it is there for is it's very important and it keeps you kind of secure and safe. The skeleton also provides space and structure for your organs within your body. So what that means is the skeleton, the shape of the hang of it, means that there is space to hang off other organs even if they're not inside things. Like the rib cage provides structure and space, but it also aids the functioning of the lungs, because as you expand the rib cage, the lungs get bigger. As you contract the rib cage, the lungs get smaller, and that helps push air in and out of your lungs. Similarly, you look in here at the like, you know, organs, like inner organs like going into the stomach, going into the liver. They're not protected by the skeleton, but they hang off it because they're attached either directly to the bones or they're hanging off other organs and held in within that structure. So it's very important, in addition to the protective function, to just providing space, because some of these organs would not be happy having the full weight of gravity on them or the full weight of, you know, external air pressure on them. They're protected by being inside the general framework and space provided by your skeleton. You can look at animals with an exterior exoskeleton and see how they function, and they have different, they can do some things the same, some things differently, because having an external skeleton as opposed to an internal skeleton. If you took a look, for example, at most animals with an exoskeleton don't have lungs. They have open channels in their carapace that they can do direct oxygen exchange with the atmosphere, but they don't have lungs because they can't flex it enough to basically move the air in and out that way. So it's a very different setup. Precisely, Firefly. Precisely. Functions of the skeleton. Now, the inside of the bones or bone marrow is the site of production of both red and white blood cells. Bone marrow transplants are given to boost people with low levels of white or red blood cells. Alright, so your bone marrow is where you produce new red and white blood cells, depending on where in the bone. A lot of your red blood cells, for example, are produced in your ribs. Now, if you have, let's say, basically you've got to transport, you got your ribs here, and you're basically, okay, well, I'll make red blood cells here. That's a logical place to make them because they can dump straight into the bloodstream and then head to the lungs. Awesome. What happens if that gets damaged? Well, if you've got low red blood cell production because of anemia, well, your problem is low iron, typically. There are other causes of anemia, but it could be that, in which case you might need just direct transplant. But if you're someone who's had cancer and you've had chemotherapy and the fast growing cells in your body have been adversely affected by the chemotherapy, well, some of your most important fast growing cells are your white and your red blood cells. They're made by your bone marrow, which is also a fast growing set of cells. So you make them, and the chemotherapy destroys or damages your fast growing set of cells. You mightn't have much functional bone marrow left, at which point there's a couple of different options. There are medications you can be given. EPO or erythropoietin is a drug which increases your production of red blood cells. It's given to people with anemia. It's given to people who are on chemotherapy. It's abused by people blood doping, in that they go on and say, okay, well, I'm in an endurance sport like cycling. If I take some erythropoietin, that greatly increases my production of red blood cells. I've got more red blood cells. I've got more oxygen. I've got a competitive advantage in cycling. And there are people, like Lance Armstrong, who could camouflage their taking of erythropoietin because they're on cancer treatment. So they will be given some erythropoietin, and because he was probably mostly having quantitative testing or qualitative testing rather than quantitative testing done on him, they're going to say, okay, there's erythropoietin present, but he's meant to have erythropoietin in the system because he's been given some because he's had chemotherapy. So yeah, okay, that's fine. unless you do the quantitative testing, you won't realize why he had much higher levels than normal. So, similarly, people who have white blood cell deficiency, because their white cell bone marrow isn't working, or the yellow bone marrow isn't working, what do you do with them? Well, there are medications that can increase the speed of production, but if it's all gone, you might need a bone marrow transplant. And a bone marrow transplant requires a transplant from somebody with a compatible blood and cell type to avoid tissue rejection. So you take that, you effectively drill a hole in their hip or somewhere, you extract some bone marrow, you drill a hole in the donor's hip and you inject it in. Very painful. Very important, but very painful. Bones can also store calcium, and bone marrow can store iron for later use. Calcium, important of course structurally in bones, and is used to help regulate nerve action. If you are incredibly deficient in calcium in your diet, your bones can start to strip out the calcium to help maintain nerve action, and you can start to develop osteoporosis, a hollowing out of the bones, which is often called brittle bones, where the low levels of calcium there get stripped out and you're left with kind of honeycomb effect on your bones, where they become hollow, and not quite hollow, but small holes in them that make them more fragile. Similarly, your bone marrow can store iron, and your bones can store iron, and that means that I had a friend of mine who got magnetized once by working in a high energy physics lab for too long. So he emitted a low level magnetic field, which gave him the superpower of mostly, destroying hotel check-in cards, because they had a weak magnetic field on them. If you touch them, they stop working. And he was magnetized for quite a while, so it made going to hotels awkward. The bone also provides attachment sites for muscles and tendons. So you basically go, okay, I want to attach my muscles and tendons to something. The bone provides ideal, inflexible, strong anchors. The bones tend to be pretty tough. If you get a muscular tear, usually what happens is you can tear off the tendon, which attaches muscle to bone, or the ligament, which attaches bone to bone, and that's very bad, often needs surgery to correct. You can, in some cases, actually the bone tears off, which is quite bad, which needs surgery and screws to fix, or in some cases tear the muscle, which may just need sutures to fix. But a lot of those, if you do that, like if you stretch them a little bit or do some micro tears, it's fine, it will heal itself. But with more serious ones, you're going to need surgery. You can also have some regulation of weight through the increase in the production of insulin in the bones. Now, bones, what are they made up of? Well, they're made up of a type of connective tissue. They're the hardest connective tissue in the body. They are 30% living tissue like collagen, 70% minerals and water. And the minerals involved are chiefly calcium and phosphorus. So again, we've mentioned calcium as being an important part of the diet. Similarly, phosphorus, though you get phosphorus from a bunch of different places, and you break down certain types of protein and DNA and stuff, you'll get some phosphorus that way. So you need to feed, it's mostly calcium your bones need. So which is why you'll often see adverts for them bones need calcium, and so on. Some of the bone is living tissue. You have growth plates in your bone when you're young, and as you get older, those growth plates fuse. Now, I mentioned when I was talking about the endocrine system that one of the things that happens with gigantism is because you have high levels of human growth hormone, your growth plates in your bones don't fuse, so they keep growing little by little. Normally, your growth plates are going to fuse in your late teens, maybe early 20s, and at that point you stop growing taller. But if you're on HGH, human growth hormone, or high levels of HGH because you're taking a supplement or you're suffering from gigantism, acromyalgia, you're going to keep growing, and those bone plates don't fuse. And you may think, awesome, I'd love to be tall. Yeah, kind of. But the problem is you grow in all directions, basically, so your bones grow out as well, so your face gets a lot wider, your hands get huge, your feet get huge. And it starts to put a massive amount of stress on your heart, because as I've mentioned, your bones and your muscles make up a huge percentage of your body weight. If you increase someone's height a foot, you often double their weight. And that's basically going out. Your heart effectively has to work twice as hard now, because the amount of blood, there's much more blood required to service that larger person, and the heart has to start getting stronger, but also bigger. And that's an issue, because if you double the size of a pump, like the heart is, you greatly increase how hard it has to work. Like if you make a pump twice as big, it doesn't require twice the power. It pretty usually requires about 4 times the power. So basically, it's the old square cube law. where you're, double the size of something, you actually cube the amount of work that's required. So, something to be aware of. Now, just on the thing of types of bones, well, all of the bones in the human body except the coccyx serve a particular need. And even the coccyx has uses. It's primarily where you attach your pelvic floor muscles at the base of your spine are often hooked onto the coccyx. Um, the long bones, such as the humerus and the femur, they act as levers. And they're the bones people often think of, oh, they're really important bones. And they are, because they're there to basically move you around mostly. They are levers to actually effectively leverage force. And the femur certainly is one of the strongest bones in the human body. Breaking a femur is usually kind of a fair amount of work. And when it does break, that's often a serious problem because you've got to immobilize a whole leg, which is no fun whatsoever. It usually means pain, can mean pins, can mean a huge cast, can mean total immobilization in the bed. It's rough stuff. Short bones are found where strength is required, such as the carpals and tarsals and the wrist and ankles. So those are short bones. They're stacked right on top of each other. They're little like bricks in a wall. And they are... a lot of weight comes on them. If you think about that, all of your body weight comes down on the tarsals and your ankles. And people do handstands, they put all their weight on their carpals. Now the carpals are vulnerable to strain. Common issues like carpal tunnel syndrome are effectively osteoarthritis that you developed in the bones of your wrist, where basically repeated pressure on it damages it. Who gets that? Tennis players, computer programmers, anyone who basically puts their wrist at a funky angle all day, puts a lot of stress in like that. You get an issue where like you can develop kind of osteoarthritis, little degeneration of those bones. Flat bones are armor. We're talking the skull, the ribs. They're basically there to protect yourself primarily. Irregular bones are the vertebrae of the spine. They're found where extra strength is needed. So, let's say you're basically you've got your spinal cord, and your spine can bend one way reasonably well. I can bend over and I'm going to touch my toes from the front, that's no problem. But the other way, if I try to bend back, the spurs on the back of the spine will lay flat against each other, and you can only go back so far. And that's to protect the spinal cord, to keep you from being damaged. Now, I could tell you have 206 bones in your body, and you kind of do. Some people will have more because of sesamoid bones. They're small rounded bones that develop in the tendons, and they smooth the movement of the tendon over certain bones, such as the patella and the kneecap. Now, the patella and the kneecap is pretty much the only one you're guaranteed to have. People, due to exercise or training or some other stuff like that, may have some more, and it's primarily the sesamoid bones, the extra bones developing people. Like you might have an extra finger or an extra toe, or maybe a slightly elongated coccyx. But for the most part, those are just bigger bones. I've known people with extra vertebrae in their spine, giving them some additional flexibility. But yeah, primarily the sesamoids are the extra ones you develop. Now, on the topic of the axial skeleton. Now, the axial skeleton is the 80 bones along the central axis of the human body. It's got 6 parts. It's got the human skull, the ossicles of the middle ear, the hyoid bone of the throat, the rib cage, sternum, and the vertebral column. So, you've got your human skull here. And now the skull is made up of several different bones fused together primarily. The only mobile part of the skull is your mandible or jaw. Inside your ears, you got the ossicles, basically 3 bones on either side, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. And the hyoid bone of the throat here is the anchor point for your trachea, which hooks you on there. You've got your bones, the rib cage, the sternum in the center, and the vertebral column, and the rib cage and the sternum are joined by the cartilage there. Mostly this is the skull and the rib cage. This is the center core of your body, your axis. And if you combine the axial and appendicular skeletons together, you get the complete skeleton. Now, what does all that mean? Well, it's so called because it forms the axis of the body. It is primarily concerned with protection of vital organs. That's the main function of the axial skeleton. There are sensory ones to do with your ossicles, your inner ear. There are, form ones as well, but it's mostly about protecting those vital organs. The brain, the spinal cord, the heart, and the lungs are all protected or given structure by that. And it's also an anchor point to attach the other bones of your skeleton, the appendicular skeleton. It has been pointed out that coccyx is a funny word, and it is indeed. The appendicular skeleton, on the other hand, is 126 bones in the human body. The word appendicular is the adjective of the noun appendage, which itself means a part of something that is joined to something larger. What's it for? Well, locomotion primarily for the lower legs and manipulation of objects in the environment for the upper limbs. Was a time when we walked on all four limbs. Evolution has seen it to we have specialized into locomoting on the lower limbs and manipulating objects in the environment. You can do a limited amount of manipulation of objects with your lower limbs, depending on how dexterous you are, and a limited amount of locomotion in your upper limbs, depending on how fit and strong you are. You can walk on your hands if you want to. Very few people do it for an extended period of time. I always challenge students to say, does anyone here bench more than they can squat? I mean, you really have to skip an awful lot of leg day before that's possible. The appendicular skeleton, on the other hand, forms during development from cartilage by the process of endochondral ossification. So it starts out when you're a baby, you have over 300 bones. And the reason, the extra bones don't just run away, they don't leave. What they are is different sections of bones that are joined by cartilage, and as you get older, the cartilage fuses together. The growth plates I was talking about earlier, that's a section of cartilage in your bone that allows it to grow and stretch. And as it stretches, basically the more cartilage grows, and the cartilage ossifies, turns into bone, and they become longer and longer bones. There are 6 major regions in the appendicular skeleton, which you can probably guess just by thinking about it. You've got the pectoral girdles, which are your shoulders, more or less. Your left and right clavicles. Now, the clavicles are also known as the collarbones, and the scapula are the shoulder blades. The arm and the forearm, you've got your left and right humerus, right, which is here, and the radius and the ulna here, which unhelpfully cross, when you turn your hands, cross over each other. Your hands basically are 54 bones. Note the number. You've got 8 carpals in this hand, 8 carpals in this one, 5 metacarpals in the palm of your hand here, 5 proximal phalanges, the 5 bones attached there, 4 middle phalanges in each finger, and then 5 distal phalanges. You note that the thumb only has 2 bones, whereas the fingers have 3. So those middle phalanges, they're there. Similarly, like if you think about that now, if you look at the structure of these ones, technically there is always an argument about whether the bones of the fingers are long bones or short bones. Similar, like they're short bones, they're quite short and squat, but functionally they're levers. So most people are kind of comfortable calling them long bones, though some people will still refer to them as short bones. They are functionally levers, though. They're for manipulating the environment, picking stuff up, putting stuff down. They're not primarily there for strength. The carpals are there for strength. They're there to take weight. But these guys, they're fragile. Never punch somebody. You're a human. You should have a tool to use instead. Never punch anybody. It's too easy to break these. Pelvis, left and right os coxae. Just a topic on microfractures of bones and strengthening. You'll often see guys in karate and stuff be able to hit bricks and break them, and you're like, oh man, that's so easy. No. Hitting it like that is probably going to break most of the bones in your hand. Karate deliberately micro stresses, a lot of the hard martial arts deliberately micro stress your bones by hitting harder and harder things you get older to cause the bones to thicken. There was a wrestler called Kenta Kobayashi who, now wrestling does a limited amount of actual hard striking, but the style he worked did quite a lot of hard striking. And when he went in for knee surgery 2 months ago, the doctor told him that he kept running out the battery on his drilling into his knee because it was so hard. That's kind of end stage, kind of hard style stuff. So yeah, if you basically micro stress and fracture your things, your bones thicken, they get tougher and harder. But unless you've done that training, don't hit people with your hand. Use a tool. Pelvis, left and right os coxae. So your pelvis is divided in left and right os coxae, and it's joined by the symphysis pubis, which is a bit of cartilage. in the symphysiotomy scandal in Ireland, they were cutting through that piece of cartilage to widen the pelvis to ease childbirth, which was, just a disaster because it weakens your ability to walk and do anything like that. Your legs break down into the thigh and leg bones. You've got your femurs here in the upper leg, then the tibia and the fibia. The tibia is the big tib and the little fib. The fibia is the little bone on the outside. If you ever go running and you start to get that hurting because you're basically bouncing off to the upside and you're putting more weight on your fibula, you just got to get your gait and analyze a bit to see if you're leaning out or leaning in or what's the problem there. Whereas the tibia is a lot stronger. Shin splints are common, getting microfractures and that, and they're just sore until they heal, basically. The patella or kneecap is the bone of the kneecap there, which is there basically to stop your patella tendon getting trapped within the major knee joint there. Feet and ankles, again, 52 bones, similar, 2 less than the hands. 14 tarsals, bones in the ankles, 5 metatarsals in each foot. Again, need to take all the weight of the body, so they tend to be very strong. Proximal phalanges, again, middle phalanges, distal phalanges, if you look at the exact same arrangement as your fingers. 2 bones in the big toe, 3 bones in all the other fingers. Yes, even the crappy little toe has 3 bones within it. Those 3 bones, however, are tiny. Alright, so that's your appendicular skeleton there. Any questions from the chat? Pop them up there and I'm happy to answer them. Now, little bit to talk about long bones. Now, a long bone has 2 rounded ends and a central shaft. It contains yellow bone marrow in the center and red bone marrow at the ends. What that means is the ends of it are producing white blood cells and the middle is producing red blood cells. The compact bone that covers them provides strength. And it's very dense. It's got no very little air pockets or anything within it. It's just hard, solid material. Whereas the cancellous bone, spongy or cancellous bone, is sometimes honeycomb bone. That's the stuff where you actually get the bone marrow. So if I took a bone marrow and I sliced through it, I would see lots of little hollows full of bone marrow. If you were the kind of person who some people do, I meet 1 or 2 every class usually, will crack open a bone, cooked bone, and will actually suck the marrow out of it to get some value from that. Highish nutrients, but not to a huge number of people's taste. Most people, but gets done. Bone marrow transplants depends what they need for the most part. Basically, the bone marrow transplants primarily are about replacing a deficiency. If you had both, they do both, as far as I know. But it's primarily white blood cells, because if it's red blood, you just give them EPO, and that usually does the job. If it's white, on the other hand, it's usually the whole thing's messed up, and it's like, okay, this person's no immune system. You can get by on lower energy red blood cells for a little while. You can't get by without an immune system. So it's mostly done for yellow bone marrow as much as they can. That's why you go into the center of the bone. Typically the hip, as I recall. Typically the hip bone of the femur. I think it's mostly the hip, because the hip is relatively easy to extract. There's a good video of some people getting it done just in terms of getting access to stem cells, not even using the white bone marrow, but basically they'll make a little incision and they'll drill a little hole, and then they'll get like a little spike and they'll hammer that in until they penetrate down to the marrow. Then they'll stick in a syringe, take it out, and in it goes. So the long bone diagram you've got is, this here is just really quick. When you get the yellow bone marrow in the center, you want yellow white cells, you go with that one. You want red cells, you go to the end. Now, important stuff about the long bones. They are covered with cartilage at the end to act as a shock absorber and protect them from stuff there. Basically protect your bones from grinding off each other. If you ever take 2 stones and you rub them together, the stones will start to fragment and break down. You don't want that. If you rub bones off each other, exactly the same thing will happen. Your joints will start to degenerate. You have both cartilage on them and sacs around them filled with fluid to protect that from happening. But if they got damaged in the case of osteoarthritis and the bones start to grind off each other, the bones will break down. You don't want that. So it's important that cartilage stays there. If they keep getting damaged, if you do high impact sports or high impact training and you break them down, they will, you're going to have to get those replaced. Now you'll notice the spongy bone up at the end, as I said, that's where your red bone marrow is. Slice through that, it's kind of honeycombed. And if you slice through the middle of the bone, you'll kind of what's called the medullary cavity. And the medullary cavity is where you find the yellow bone marrow. It's kind of a gap in the middle of the bone. And you will also notice that there are red red arteries and blue veins coming out of that. That's because there's living material in those cells, it needs a blood supply to keep alive. So your bones, while being largely inorganic, have a living core that needs to be fed blood to keep it alive. If that gets cut off from its blood supply, the bone marrow in that bone will die and the bone will start to weaken. Not very good. Also, on the outside of the long bone and covering all of your bones, you have a layer of skin called the periosteum. Now, the periosteum's job is to attach tendons and ligaments to the bone. If you've ever messed around with bone, you're not really going to hook on. There's no anchor points, no hooks to stick on tendons and ligaments. But if you've ever eaten a chicken wing, you might find a little white fibrous material stuck on the bone. It looks a little bit like meat, but it's not coming off whatever you're doing. That's probably the end of a ligament or tendon, probably the end of a tendon. And it's attached to the bone. How it's attached on is there's a web of periosteum all over it. And when you pull and tug it in, there you go. So that stuff is kind of tightly, that's how you attach ligaments and tendons. You can't just staple them on. You can, but it's not the best solution in the world. So that's how that hooks on. It also means if you develop bone cancer and you get bone, little random bone growths, they can push through that periosteum, and that's tremendously painful. That's where why bone cancer is horrific when it happens. It's not that common, but it's horrific when it happens because the bone, basically little growths start to push through and penetrate the periosteum, and that's really, really painful. There's some really nasty diagrams of skulls afflicted with bone cancer, and there's all these little growths, pointy growths popping out of it, and they just pierce through the periosteum, and that's immensely painful. Now, red and yellow bone marrow. Red bone marrow makes red blood cells transport oxygen around the body, which you've covered before. Yellow bone marrow makes white blood cells to defend the body from disease. And the periosteum is a skin covering the bone and allows tendons and ligaments to attach to that bone. Now, quick question to talk about joints. Yeah, bone contusions and hematomas similarly mess that stuff up. Also unpleasant. If you get bones, kind of pulverized or bleeding, that can distend the periosteum. Again, very unpleasant, and that's primarily, I believe, the source of the pain, because I don't think the bones have much in the way of nerve cells in them, but the periosteum probably does. Okay, 3 main types of joints. Now, I'm gonna try to make this distinction clear. If I talk about types of joints, I'm talking about the movability of the joints. Within the synovial joints, the freely movable joints, there are 6 types of synovial joint. So if I say 3 types of joint or 3 types of synovial joint, they're actually different. The first one is that the fibrous or immovable joint, no movement's possible. This is your skull as the kind of classic example of this. In the cartilaginous joint, some movement is possible. The ribs are the big example of this. And the synovial joints are all the stuff you think of as joints, which are freely moving. So your fibrous joints here, for example, are the fixed joints. They can't move. These are the sutures or joins between the skull bones. So you have your skull, you've got a join there between it. When you were a baby, that came out in several different flexible pieces. As you got older, those knitted together. When you're a baby, you had a little hole at the top of your skull. Basically, where the skull plates didn't fit together yet. Don't poke babies in that hole. And as that grows, it fuses together and it becomes one, and it stops being movable. Why are babies' skulls movable like that? Well, it's primarily to aid delivery. We as humans are probably born a little early. If you know have a horse born that can walk in a couple of minutes, humans are going to take probably a year, less in some cases, more in others, because we come out with very big heads. Our heads are very large due to our relatively large brains, and that means that they come out easier to deliver, and then as the brain continues to grow, the brain isn't getting squashed against the skull can grow as well, and then it fuses into one piece, and after basically a couple of months, that is fused totally together and there's no hole anymore. So that flexible nature of the skull is an advantage when giving birth, but you just have to protect the kid, and babies are super vulnerable for that reason. And when you hold a baby, you always support the neck, and same way you hold a microscope, you always support the neck and hold the bottom. Now, those joints as well are pretty tough. It's difficult. Like usually that joint is nearly stronger than the bone on the other side. It usually won't break on the joints, it'll break to one side of the joint. Now, your cartilaginous joints here, we've got the small range of motion. Now this is primarily the rib cage. So you've got the rib cage here, which allows the rib cage to flex in and out, in and out, in and out. And you've got also the vertebral discs between the vertebral columns. You've got the growth plates in the long bones, and you've got the symphysis pubis again on the pelvis. You can't move these a lot, but you can move them a little, and a little is often enough. So, small amount of flex, they can move a bit, they can't move too far without tearing the cartilage. A friend of mine once managed to tear the cartilage on one side of his rib cage by too aggressively chest bumping another person. One jumped high, one jumped low, and the other guy hit up and tore the cartilage all down one side. So he spent basically about 6 months being unable to laugh, or at least laughing. Whenever he laughed, he hurt himself. Tears in those ones, like if you damage the discs, you can get an issue where the material inside the disc start to bulge out, and that's basically your typical bulging disc, which will often require surgery to resolve because it can be very painful. It can start to press down on the nerves in that area. Now, synovial joints. These are the ones in which case there are 6 types. They are freely movable joints. The ends are covered in articular cartilage to act as both shock absorber and help reduce friction. So, we talked about this before. You don't want the bone grinding on the bone. If the bone starts to grind on the bone, the whole thing will start to break down, and start to wear away the bone. You do not want that. They're covered in articular cartilage that acts as both a shock absorber and helps to reduce friction. Ligaments here will attach bone to bone. So basically, you take the bones, you effectively held together by the ligaments, and the ligaments have a little bit of flex in them, a little bit of stretch, but not a huge amount. You don't want them stretching too much. And the space between the bones is called the bone cavity. It's wrapped in a synovial membrane filled with synovial fluid to lubricate the joints and provide the hyaline cartilage with nutrients to keep it healthy and growing. If you get a bit of cartilage knocked off, it can actually continue to grow, or at least not degenerate, and that can get lodged between joints, which can be very painful. So that's a common cause of like microsurgery, laparoscopic surgery. They go in, they just take a little bit of cartilage that becomes stuck in the bones, stuck between the joints, and continue to grow. So you've got 6 types of synovial joints. You've got the hinge, the pivot, the ball and socket, the condyloid, the gliding, and the saddle. Now, hinge joint. So hinge joint is your classic knee or elbow. It's got basically one range of motion there. It's got a round surface that fits in the hollow surface of the bone and opens and closes like that. There's a similar movement to that of a hinge or a door, basically just flexion and extension. Flexion is when the bone draws in like that. Extension is when it goes out like that. So flexion, extension. Hinge joint, very straightforward range of motion. It's basically your knee, your elbow, your classic examples. I always like to go down the arm for these. So basically, the hinge is that one there. We'll talk about the ball and socket here. We'll talk about the sliding and gliding there. So the ball and socket, you get a rounded cup. It fits in a cup-shaped cavity, but this one has a lot more range of motion available to it. Again, you've got flexion extension, which is basically closing in towards the body line, closing away from the body, right? But you also have, if you imagine the body line here in the middle like this, you've got abduction is when it moves away from the body line. Adduction is when it comes towards the body line. Then you have rotation, where you can turn the arm around like that. But you also have circumduction, when you can rotate the arm to form a circle like that. And those are distinct different ranges of motion. Shoulder and the hip do that one. So they're some of the most mobile joints in the body, and as a result are somewhat vulnerable to dislocation. It's an interesting one. If you look at the best power lifters in the world, are often found in Eastern Europe, because it's quite common to have something called Dalmatian hip. There's a genetic characteristic where they have basically greater flexibility in that area. They can squat deeper effectively because of that thing, but they're also at greater risk of dislocations. And that's basically just like a little quirk of genetics that gives them a competitive advantage in that particular arena. You can have a look at Irish people as well. There's a couple of things about the way our joints aren't as flexible there, and we've got basically a lot less motility in the hips, as I recall, but it makes us better at punching. So that's why a lot of Irish champion boxers are basically down to some tightness there. It's a little bit of unusual genetic fluctuations within small populations. Now, the saddle joint is like a hinge joint, but there's a bit more available to it. So this is, you get the thumb and the jaw. And what it can do is, it can open and shut, so the jaw can open and shut. It can adduct, where it comes back towards the body. Like it's abducted, goes away from the body, you stick the jaw out. And it can do a slight amount of circumduction when you rotate around, right? So similarly, flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and then you can also do a little bit of around the houses with the thumb. Not much rotation really, but a little bit around the houses with the thumb. So that's your saddle joint, jaw or thumb. Basically that joint in the thumb there. That's a hinge joint there, but that joint in the thumb there. And the pivot and condyloid. Now the pivot are, I want you to imagine the first cervical vertebrae. Stick the head, skull on top of the spinal cord, and we can do back and forth. You rotate around the second to turn the head. We can't do much more than about 180 speed spin. That the spinal cord, the vertebral column gets in the way, and we can't twist the spinal cord around all the way. Even owls can't do the. They can do nearly like 270, but they can't go much beyond that because you can't just go all the way with twist the spinal cord. Condyloid joints allow flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. Rotation is limited, so we're talking between the metacarpals and the phalanges here. So this guy here can do flexion, you can do abduction, adduction, but you can't really you can rotate it a bit yourself manually. But actually, rotating those fingers is tough. Gliding joints, two flat surfaces of bone that glide over each other to allow abduction and adduction of movement. Right, so you can go in and out, kind of side to side. So wrists and tarsals of the ankles. Now, that's most of what I want to cover today. I will, of course, basically answer any questions about assignments or otherwise at this point. Other than that, I've just basically got a common exam question up there, which is to name the three main types of joint in the human body. If I say three main types of joint, I'm looking for fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints. And if I ask for name three synovial joints, I want basically hinge joint, ball and socket, and gliding, work down the arm. Ball and socket, hinge, gliding joint there. Basically covers everything for us there. So, if there are any questions, I am here for questions for the next couple of minutes. Question raised of how owls work. Do you mean flight? Do you mean eating things? Do you mean, swooping through the sky and terrifying mice? What's the specific question? Only at night. Well, yeah, that's true. Well, they're mostly nocturnal. Just they're well adapted to it. Very quiet, scary. Swoop in over the ground, making no noise, and snatch up poor mice who are just hanging out there. The neck joint, just probably greater flexibility. If you took a look at the skeleton, I would say they don't have the big prolonged tail on the vertebra that gets the one that bit that gets in the way, you know. So yeah, I would say I would examine the skeleton and see what the skeleton looks like. I don't think, like, we've got this big tail on the vertebrae. If you kind of feel down, and that's the kind of the lumps you feel there, and as you twist there, they will get in the way to keep you from going more. And I would say the shoulder blades as well are a factor, and the muscles only have so much stretch in them, so it's probably to do with that. I can look it up, of course. So yeah. Alrighty. So, as I said, I will not be on tomorrow, but I will be on Wednesday to do some stuff about microbiology. Specifically, I'm going to do some stuff on viruses because I feel that's appropriate at the moment, and I'll do a little bit of a presentation on the coronavirus and as it applies to the study of viruses as part of microbiology. It's likely you're going to get either a question on microbiology or a question on viruses on the microbiology exam paper, or the question on viruses on the biology paper. You'll get it on one of them. This questions I often ask here on the bones are label and identify some bone in the exam. There might be short questions on labeling and identifying bones. There might be a little bit about functions of the skeleton. There might be a little bit about some other stuff. The content I've covered here should cover you for the exam. And that exam, again, I'll remind you, the anatomy and physiology exam is worth 60%. There will probably be part of a long question or a full long question on the skeleton. Those questions are worth. There are four long questions. They are worth 8 marks each. So it's of the 60 marks going for the anatomy and physiology exam, probably 8 of them will go for the skeleton, or at least 4 of them will go for the skeleton. Alright, so worth reviewing. If there are no more questions, I will call it there. Thank you everybody for coming along, and if you are watching or listening later, good stuff, and I will see you on Wednesday. Live long and prosper.